man whose ambition would consume nations, exhaust empires, and drag most of Europe into conflict: Napoleon Bonaparte. For the first time in generations, Britain faced an existential threat not across an ocean, but just across the English Channel. Napoleon brought much of continental Europe under his control, and crucially, he aimed to break Britain's dominance at sea and, if possible, invade the British Isles themselves. Suddenly, every ship, every soldier, and every pound Britain could spare was needed in Europe. From London's perspective, the choice became brutally simple. Retaking America would mean reopening a costly, drawn-out war across the Atlantic. It would mean fighting on hostile terrain against a population that had already proven it couldn't be easily subdued. And it would mean doing all of that while facing the most dangerous military power Europe had seen in centuries. So Britain made a calculation. While Napoleon marched armies across Europe, Britain poured its resources into defending its homeland, protecting its trade routes, and preventing a single power from dominating the continent. The fate of a former colony, however symbolic, could not compete with the risk of losing the empire itself. By the time the Napoleonic Wars consumed Europe, America wasn't a wound Britain wanted to reopen. It was a chapter that, for the moment, had to stay closed. However, the British colonial greed would soon set its eye upon a new, richer host: India. Through the East India Company, Britain was already extracting wealth on a scale the American colonies had never come close to matching. Spices, tea, textiles, opium, and access to vast population centers flowed into British hands. Entire regional economies were being reorganized to serve imperial trade. By the early 1800s, the revenues generated through India dwarfed what Britain had ever earned from its former colonies in North America. And unlike America, India didn't require constant military occupation across thousands of miles of hostile countryside. Control was concentrated. Profits were predictable. Resistance, while real, could be managed without draining the empire's core resources. So Britain adjusted. The empire that had once expanded through territorial pride began to operate through balance sheets. Decisions were no longer driven by wounded prestige or the desire to reclaim lost land. They were driven by return on investment. And by the early 19th century, America had already become a former asset whose cost now outweighed its value. And then came 1812. By this point, Britain was still locked in a life-or-death struggle with Napoleon. Europe was burning. Armies were clashing across the continent, and the fate of the British Empire was still very much undecided. It was in the middle of this global war that the United States made a bold and risky move. It declared war on Britain. For the British, this was an inconvenience, an irritation arriving at the worst possible time. America was opening a second front, while Britain was already fighting for its existence closer to home. And yet, even distracted and overstretched, the colonial veteran Britain proved something important. With only a fraction of its military committed to North America, British forces still managed to hit the young republic hard. American ports were blockaded. Trade was strangled. The U.S. Treasury was crippled. And British troops marched deep enough inland to do the unthinkable. They burned Washington, the Capitol, the White House. The heart of the American government went up in flames. If Britain had ever wanted to reclaim the United States, this was the moment. America was vulnerable. Its army was small. Its infrastructure was limited. Its government was still finding its footing. And Britain had just demonstrated that it could strike wherever it wanted along the American coast. But it didn't try to stay. There was no attempt to occupy the country, no effort to dismantle the government, no plan to reassert colonial rule. Because by 18